If I could interview any author, dead or alive, who would I interview and what kind of questions would I ask? Hey Dragonlings, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Skye. I'm a fantasy author who typically writes paranormal romance under the name SD Hegyes, and today we're answering another Author Answers question. Author's Answers is based off a blog I found where a bunch of authors got together and answered a question every week, so that they created a new blog post every week with all of the answers combined into one post. And I have taken that idea and changed it to video format. I will have the blog itself listed in the description if you're interested in checking that out, as well as a direct link to the blog post that today's question comes from. And today's question is, if you could interview any author, who would it be and what kind of questions would you ask? There are a couple different authors that I would interview if I got the opportunity, and while I would have separate questions for each of them, there are a couple questions I have that I would ask all of them, or anyone I actually interview if I were to ever interview anyone. The first of those questions that I would ask anyone is, what is your writing process from idea to publication if you publish your stories, or to finished draft if you do not publish your stories? And then the second question I would ask is, what is your ideal writing routine? Like, when you are having like your best writing day, what does your routine look like for that day? And those questions I would ask any author, no matter who they were. However, there are a couple of specific authors I would also like to interview, and I have specific questions I would ask them. The first of which is Mercedes Lackey. Mercedes Lackey is a sci-fi fantasy author. She is the author of a universe known as Valdemar, which contains many series, standalones, as well as anthologies. I have loved her work for a long time. I have not even read all of her work because she just has so many. And if you were to ask me what my favorite book is, it is Magic's Pawn by Mercedes Lackey. That is my introduction to epic fantasy. It's my introduction to many things LGBTQA+. I just adore that book. It is fantastic. Do I recommend that book for someone who just wants to get introduced to Mercedes Lackey? No, I actually recommend the series called Arrows of the Queen. That was more a YA book and a very good intro to the series. However, my introduction to the series was Magic's Pawn, and that is still like my favorite ever. I love Vanielle as a character, and I love Yafans as a companion. It's just so good. Anyways, the questions I would ask. The first question I would ask Mercedes Lackey is, how do you decide what story in the Valdemar world to write? Because again, Valdemar is such a giant universe, and the books she's written have been various inserts in a single timeline within that world that crossed ages. In fact, actually, if you look at the timeline, Vanielle's story, the Magic's Pawn series, comes before Arrows of the Queen, which includes Talia's story. And while I do recommend you read Talia's story first if you're just being introduced to the Valdemar world, and I was introduced in Vanielle's story, which comes before it, there's actually a few series even before that that she wrote and published later. Like Arrows of the Queen was one of the first ones she published, and then my introduction was Vanielle's story. So my question would be, how did you decide what story in the Valdemar world to write? How did you decide which of those characters' stories need to be told? Especially like she just released a new release that it further develops Vanielle's tale, because Vanielle's tale in I think it's the Last Herald Mage series. I think that's the name of the series that I read. It's got 3 books in it. Magic's Pawn, Magic's Promise, and Magic's Price. And it's literally from before he even discovered he had magic to his death. But there's so much story in between all of that, and she just released a new book many, many years later after the publication of those 3 that dives more into his story before his death. And I'm just like, I can't wait to read it. I need to get my hands on a physical copy. But yeah, that would be my first question. How did you decide which story to tell in the Valdemar world? My second question would be, do you struggle to keep the myths and legends of characters straight as you write in the world? Because as we know, myth and legends are affected over time and changed over time as they're retold by different people who just change itty bitty tidbits here and there. It's like a game of telephone where at the start of the line, you have someone who says one thing, and by the time you get to the end of the line, it's a completely different thing. It's that. It's exactly that. And so my question would be, do you struggle to keep the myths and legends that people in a later timeline know versus the stories that actually occurred in the prior timeline? I just think that concept would be so cool. And I would honestly ask that question of anyone, but specifically her, because I have dived into so many different stories in that universe that cross such a giant timeline. And it's just, yeah. And then my third and final question for her would be, how much does your writing change with the myths and legends of a character who's a legend in one book and then gets their own story? Like, maybe she wrote a story about a character who in this story was a myth and legend and was like, oh, I actually want to write their story, and then goes and writes their story. How much of that myth and legend is actually transferred to this story? It's kind of like a follow-up to my previous question, actually. How much of that story that is told is factual versus what actually happens? And how do you decide that? Like, I just want to know. Again, because she's one of the only people I've read. There are more people. I think Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere universe or Cosmere world is pretty much the same thing. It crosses same timeline, different stories across the same timeline. I think it's the same thing. But I haven't read any Brandon Sanderson, whereas I have read Mercedes Lackey. And I just, the thought process that goes into building such a world is so mind-boggling to me that I absolutely want to, like, just pick her brain about how she goes about doing it. And I'm just like, I want to know. I just want to know. The second author that I would interview is Walter Farley. Walter Farley is most known for the Black Stallion series. He wrote that. There was like 20-something books in the series. I don't remember exactly how many. And then he left notes, and his son took over the series and wrote the last couple books with him before his death. And then his son took over and completed the series entirely on his own without his dad's notes. So, very prolific author. They wrote, I think between the two of them in that particular series, there's like 26 books. And then his son, Stephen Farley, went on to write another series that's kind of like, not a sequel series, but kind of like goes along beside those last few. And there's like 7 or 8 in that series, maybe more, maybe less. I don't know exactly. I haven't looked into it. I have actually not read all of the books in the Black Stallion series, but I grew up, that was like one of my introductions to horse books was the Black Stallion series, plus the movie, Black Stallion and Black Stallion Returns. And then later down the line, when I was already a teenager, Young Black Stallion came out. But, and the Young Black Stallion is actually based off of one of the books he and his son wrote, not one he wrote. So that's a fun fact. But having grown up with both the books and the movies, I think it's fantastic that he wrote so many books in one world, and they all revolve around one particular set of characters, following mainly Alec and the Black in the first couple of books, and then going on with different characters as well as like side characters and the breeding lineage of the Black as they continued the adventures and the descendants of the Black Stallion. So I just think it would be cool. So my first question to Walter Farley would be, how did you balance fact and fiction in your Black Stallion series? Because for anyone who doesn't know, Black Stallion was about a racehorse of unknown origin who does this like match race in the first book after he and Alec are rescued from an island after their boat crashed, and basically they were the only survivors of the boat crash, and they got crashed onto an island. They survived, I don't remember how long they survived on the island before they were rescued. And then after the rescue, he went on to tame this wild Black Stallion and race him against, in a match race. He was like a mystery contender in a match race between two pedigreed thoroughbred horses that were competing head to head for championship, basically. But later on in the series, we bring in some more historical racehorses, and there's even books that talk about Man of War and other famous racehorses during the time period that Walter Farley set these books in. And so my question would be, how did you balance the fact and fiction in that series without like taking away from the factual depictions of the different races throughout the history? I would just be curious how he did that. My second question would be, how did you decide what way to take the series across so many books, because of the fact that there were so many and we were following so many different adventures? And I think while we follow different descendants of the Black throughout the series, the Black appears in many books still near the end of the 20 plus series. And by that time, he is not a young horse anymore. In fact, actually, I think in the first book I don't think they revealed his age in the first book. I think it wasn't until the second book that they revealed his age. But he wasn't already a young stallion by racehorse terms, because racehorses usually get started in training as yearlings, and then they go on to race their first couple of races at like the age of 2. In fact, actually, I think the Kentucky Derby, there are parameters you have to follow in the Kentucky Derby, and I think a horse has to be 3 years old. It's either 2 or 3. I cannot remember. I think 3. I think it's 3. But they're young horses still. They're young and fit horses. And if I remember right, when they did the match race, and we finally discover his age in the second book in the series, he's no longer a young horse. He is not an old horse by any means, but by racehorse standards, he is not a young horse. And they established that in the second book, I believe, not the first book. And even by the end of the series, there are still books he is appearing in. And this is after his descendants have been in races and retired from racing. So I'm just curious how Walter Farley decided to take the direction of the books as he went, and which descendants to follow, and how to piece together the different myths and legends that he included in the stories. I want to pick his mind and just see where the thought process came from. And then finally, my third and final question for Walter Farley would be, did any of your own animals inspire the horses mentioned in the Black Stallion series? Just because I'm curious, when I've done horses in my own stories, for those who are unaware, for the first 15 plus years of my life, from the time I was 5 to the time I was in my teens, early 20s, my parents bred and raised Shetland ponies and Shetland pony crosses. So I have a lot of experience with Shetland ponies and Arabian horses especially. Not high-end pedigree breeds, but like just, I don't want to go as far as to say backyard breeding, because some of the ponies we bred went on to go to different championships, but we did not breed and raise ponies for different championship stuff. Not the point. The point is that some of the horses that I have owned throughout the years, their personalities and their traits have appeared in horses in my own books. And I'm curious if some of the stuff that Walter Farley put in his books were traits based on animals he's owned himself. So I would just be curious. I want to know. I'm curious and I want to know. And then finally, these questions aren't directed to any author in particular. It's just something I would like to know from any author who has passed on, who has died, whose books have become movie or TV adaptations now. So, especially like the reason I thought about this question was because Robert Jordan is the author that comes to mind. He has passed on. His last book was finished by Brandon Sanderson, and based on his notes, to finish up the Wheel of Time series. But since his death, they have also done a Wheel of Time series, which I think has been canceled at this point. I have not watched it. My dad, who loved the Wheel of Time series, both the books, watched the show, and he was like, "You're not going to like this if you like the books." And I was like, okay, cool. And I haven't watched it yet because of that. But I know that they just recently announced that they're going to be doing an animated series. I'm not certain how true that is. Haven't looked into it myself. I just saw it like in passing kind of thing. And I think they're going to be doing an animated series to replace the canceled show. I don't know. I don't really care. But that information was what inspired this one. And I was like, okay, now I'm curious. Anyone who has passed on, how do you feel about TV movie adaptations? So my questions, and I have 3 questions for these, any author who has passed on, who now has movie TV show adaptations. First question would be, what do you think of the way people have interpreted your work? Because as we know, movies are a different medium than books, and they are interpreted differently, and adaptations don't necessarily follow the books that inspire them. So that would be my first question. My second question is, what are your favorite adaptations, if there are more than one? Again, this question was inspired by a specific author because they have announced a new interpretation of Pride and Prejudice. I don't know when it comes out. I just know that it's coming out. And then there's also the new show, The Other Bennett Sister, that just came out. That might actually be the other rendition I'm thinking of. But there's the 2005 Pride and Prejudice. There's the 1990 something, 3 or 5, I don't remember which, Pride and Prejudice. One with Matthew McFadden, I think his name is, and then one with Colin Firth. So like, and then there's many more than that. So my question would be, and that's what inspired this question. So my question would be, which one is your favorite? Of the adaptations that have occurred of your work, which one's your favorite? So that I think that would be fun to ask, because I would be curious. Like, I would love to just pick Jane Austen's mind and be like, so, who's your favorite Mr. Darcy? I'd just find out. I think it would be fun. And then my third and final question for anyone who's passed on who has a TV movie adaptation of their work. What's a medium you would have loved to see your work as, other than writing? Whether it's a play, graphic novel, animation, live action, anything. Because again, different types of medium interpret works differently. A play is going to be different than a book. A movie is going to be different than a play and a book. A graphic novel is going to be different than all of those. There are so many different interpretations for the kind of work that is done that I would just be curious to go back, especially, and like Jane Austen would be a perfect example in this case, because the fact that graphic novels did not exist in her time period. And I would be curious, so if you're a ghost and you're hanging out in our time period, what medium would you love to see Pride and Prejudice as? I would just be curious, because I think that would be so fun. Can you imagine asking Edgar Allan Poe what he would love to see The Raven as? I'm pretty certain there's a graphic novel of The Raven. Would he have loved to have read it? Would he have loved it if it was like a short film, a movie, a play? Like, I want to know. I want to know. So there you have it. Those are the authors I would interview and the questions I would ask. If you've made it this far in the video, leave me some kind of newspaper emoji. And my question for you is, if you could interview any author, who would you ask and what kind of questions? Anyways, that is all I have for you guys today. I will see you all in my next video. Bye, Dragonlings.